the Roman conquest of the Eastern Roman Empire, so the city founded by one of the many cities that Alexander named after himself. But anyway, one of the ones that actually took off, or the one that took off the most and became the most important. And so it also became the center of learning for the after Athens and the whole classical period of Greek thought. Now when we get to this later, what's called Hellenistic period, where Greek thought expands now because of Alexander and his successors all across the Eastern Mediterranean, and frankly dominates also Rome in the West too. Then Alexandria is actually where the center of learning happened, and we're aware very much of the famous library and all the different times that it's burned and all of the different losses that represented. And the library then being part of a very famous learning complex school and temple, which was called it's dedicated to the Muses, and it was therefore called the Museion, or the museum. And so then all of our museums are named after that, in the same way that all of our academies are named after Plato's school in Athens. All of our lycea are named after Aristotle's school in Athens. So all of our museums are named after this learning here in Alexandria. So it's the capital of Egypt in the Hellenistic period. So when we think of the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, she is, she's the queen of Egypt, but she's Greek, right? And so she's from this family descended from Ptolemy, Alexander's general. Alexander's generals is when Alexander died, they all split his empire up, and Ptolemy, in my opinion, was the smartest. He just ran straight for Egypt, and decided, crowned himself pharaoh, and that's the most solid chunk of any part of empire to kind of make your base. And the Ptolemies did very, very well for themselves all the way up till when, anyway, none of the Eastern kingdoms were able to hold out against the strength of Rome and Rome's capacity and power. Although Cleopatra did a pretty good job playing the Roman general game. Just picked the losing side a couple too many times, or one at least who won too many times. So it continued then to be the center of Hellenistic culture and learning once it was part of the empire. Alexandria, the population, we never know in terms of these ancient cities. A lot of times people always want to say there's 1 million people. Whatever, it's a huge number. It's one of these big ancient cities, like Babylon before it, Rome, later Constantinople in the west here, but anyway, Alexandria, so they say maybe 500,000. And it did include the very largest concentration, or the largest community, so a big percentage of that 500,000 are Jewish people, Israelites from the Second Temple Judaism. And so although a lot of times when we think of this kind of time period, which is the time period when this particular time, Judea and the land, what's Palestine and Israel now, are part of essentially a client kingdom, or later a province of the Roman Empire ruled directly. So under the last dynasty, the Herodians, so Herod, who is essentially a part Jewish, part Idumean king, who is essentially the successor of this Maccabean dynasty, which was the last kind of independent Jewish dynasty of this kind of kingdom. Prior to that, it had been a province of first the Ptolemies and then the Syrians, which is to say the Greeks that are ruling that, and then prior to that of Persia. So anyway, so even though when the Second Temple is in Jerusalem, and it hasn't yet been destroyed now by the Romans, which is going to happen in 70 of the Common Era, we kind of focus on the temple, and we focus on the Sadducees that are around it, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and Qumran. We're thinking about the land. But actually there's a lot more people, a lot more Jewish people in a big city like Alexandria, and in some sense they're way more important because Alexandria is so important in influencing the whole planet. And so anyway, so this is a very important diaspora community, and in fact the religion of Judaism from the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, in the 6th century BC, is often practiced, or mostly practiced, in diaspora, which is to say in the exile community, as opposed to people that are living in the land. Right now, maybe half of Jews in the world now have also moved back to now the state of Israel and are in the land, and half are not in diaspora still. Okay. So diaspora Judaism and the Septuagint. So we've also talked about this. So Egypt had been home then to a very large community of diaspora Jews since the destruction of the first Jerusalem temple in the 6th century. And so the Babylonians destroyed that. A whole bunch of the exiles we know, which is called the Babylonian captivity, a whole bunch of the nobles get taken to Babylon, and it's called the Babylonian captivity. But a whole bunch of leaders flee on their own to Egypt, and that includes people like the prophet Jeremiah. And so they establish a very significant exile or diaspora Jewish community in Egypt. In the course of the time period under the direction of the Ptolemies, commissioned potentially by them according to legend again, 70 Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the text of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. It occurred over the course of, now we see, the 3rd to 2nd centuries BCE, and this important text became known as the Septuagint, which just means 70 in Greek. So essentially the translation of the 70, taking the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, and bringing them into Greek for the first time. So as it's now constituted, much later than that translation of the Septuagint, so in Rabbinic Judaism, after the destruction of the Second Temple, the canon of the Hebrew Bible is in these components: Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. I don't speak Hebrew, so I always say these wrong, but that makes an acronym, Tanakh. And so this is essentially 24 books, and that's what's canonized now in the Hebrew Bible canon within Rabbinic Judaism. There were lots of other books that are scripture-like, and that could have gotten put in, and some, maybe could have and maybe would have, and were revered as Hebrew Bible or scripture by all kinds of people, including, for example, the Qumran folks and the Essenes who are writing the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's all kinds of texts that they revered that didn't make it into what's the canon now, right? But they would have put it in the canon as far as they were concerned. So that's also true then for these 70, or what becomes the Septuagint in Alexandria. So these are also organized in quite a different way, and this is the earlier organization actually. And so these are the books that are called law, which is to say the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. History, which is a different kind of category, the wisdom books and the prophets. And so the minor prophets, which is just one book in the Hebrew canon, is like separated out into 12 little tiny books. And so essentially there's more books that are in the Septuagint than in the current rabbinic canon. Okay, for Christians, the New Testament authors exclusively quote the Septuagint. And so this is kind of a strange or an interesting phenomenon, because when we're talking about, for example, gospel narrative, Jesus and his immediate 12 disciples, all of those folks would have been Second Temple Jewish practitioners from the Galilee region mostly, who probably spoke as their primary language Aramaic. And so then if they were quoting scripture, unless they all knew Greek, they would have maybe been quoting it either, they probably would have been quoting it in Hebrew. So in other words, because they didn't bother to translate it because the languages are close enough. However, anytime you get to a Bible quote, a Hebrew Bible quote in the New Testament, it's not like somebody has taken a text that was just written, let's say, in Aramaic, and then they just quote, let's say, the Bible directly in Hebrew, and now they have now translated that into Greek, and so then you would have a very different translation of that text than what the Septuagint gives. Instead, you get to that point, and then you just get a Septuagint quote. So essentially, the people who are composing the texts of the Christian New Testament are all writing in Greek to start with, in other words. And they are themselves supplying the quotes. They are not working from some kind of crib notes that they were writing around after Jesus, or eyewitness accounts or whatever, that where they're just taking down the Aramaic. So there we go. So then, so part of the other thing is then the Septuagint also then became the basis for the Christian Old Testament, right? So initially the Christian church is primarily a Greek-speaking church, and so they didn't go back to the original Hebrew and make a new translation. They just have that Greek. And indeed, when the Latin church gets going In the West, they just translate St. Jerome. They do have the Hebrew available. Jerome only knows Hebrew so well. They translate from the Septuagint. Okay, and so the canon becomes fixed in the 5th century. So anyway, in part, in reaction to Greek Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism ceased to use the Septuagint and also much of the other Hellenistic Jewish writing that was in Greek, and so we'll talk about that in the course of this. And then during the Protestant Reformation in modern times, Protestants translated the Old Testament into current vernacular languages directly from the Hebrew, rejecting then the Septuagint and therefore the books that didn't make it into the rabbinic canon. So a very weird thing that happens is Protestants in modern times then, because they want to do a direct translation from the Hebrew, they pick up the neighbors in Europe who are Jews who have all of these scrolls. They translate directly from that. They realize, hey, all these books that are in our Bible aren't in this, so they chuck them. And that becomes what Christians call Protestants call the Apocrypha, Catholics and people in the East call the Deuterocanonicals. Do we get that? Yeah, you have the.
I just wondered if you would go back about 5 slides, starting with the Tanakh, because it was hard to follow the progressions. I'd just like to have another look at some of those.
Of all of them, I think I'm going to have one more here. Let's see if I have it. No, I'll have to go back. Okay. So this one. So you can't see them all, but essentially it's law, prophets, and writings. And so this is the Hebrew Bible as what's kind of considered to have made it into the canon, what the rabbis allowed in as of the modern, not modern, but in common era times, right? So AD times. And so so the prophets are things like Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets all lumped together in one book. So that's like Micah and all those guys. The writings over here are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah as one book, and Chronicles together as one book. So that's the Hebrew canon. Then, in terms of the broader Christian canon, the essentially Catholic and Orthodox canons, same 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then the history books are what are some cases the prophet books in the Hebrew canon, so Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel. So Ruth gets stuck over here, so they kind of try to order this in kind of a more historical order as they understand it. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Tobit, Judith, Esther, Maccabees, and maybe Maccabees. So all those Maccabees books. Psalms, Manasseh, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Psalm of Solomon, the minor prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Baruch, Lamentations of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. So those are tiny writing, I'm sorry. So anyway, you can see lots more books make it in to the Septuagint than are in the either Protestant or rabbinic canons. So these books don't make it in to the what's now the rabbinic Jewish canon or Protestant. Okay, so that's why, like I say, there's a weird dividing line then. So Rabbinic Judaism, Protestants over here, Orthodox and Catholics over there. Okay, so that's just kind of a context. So that is the Septuagint is the scriptures that Philo uses. So Philo is in essentially from the beginning. You know, he's born and he's a young man in the BCE times, and then as an adult in the Common Era times. He comes from a very wealthy and important Hellenized Jewish family that's in Alexandria. His brother, Alexander, so a lot of times, people will have these Greek names also when you're Hellenized. So Alexander is a Roman customs agent who's responsible for collecting all the duties on all imports into Alexandria from the eastern part of the empire. So this is a hugely important and also a kind of a job that you make a lot of money on. So,
can anybody read the Hebrew that's on the top of his cloak?
Not me.
No, not me either. Here, take the mic.
Ashur, it says on his hat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ashur.
Do you know what it means, Ashur, or is it just the name?
Well, it's the name of a city, isn't it?
Is the name of one of the tribes of Israel? Or Asher? Or no, Ashur is different?
No,
No,
not
okay.
one of the 12, no.
So,
I think it's the name of a place.
place name maybe?
Yeah, because this is
Oh, Assyria.
Aleph, Shin, Vav, Resh, so Ashur.
How about on his cloak?
It says, I can't make out what this says. Avinoam, Abishai, Eliata, Eliel. I don't know.
Okay, so we don't know. This is not an ancient portrait.
Oh, no.
So just so we're aware, I'm going to show this a bunch of different times.
Eliata, you are my God.
Oh.
Avishai, Avinoam, Abishai are names of people. Abigail, or I think it says Abigail. Abigail, like a name of a woman, I don't know. But Eliata, you are my God. And Eli, my God, my God.
My God. So it's probably a prayer, right? Kind of thing? Or some of the Psalms. Okay. Anyway, it's not a ancient portrait. So this is something that somebody in the Renaissance would have done, and they would have anyway. So okay. Philo's family and their prominence. So one of Philo's nephews married a daughter of Herod Agrippa I. So we mentioned these Herodians, who from Herod the Great are this dynasty of the client kings of Judea and the surrounding areas under the Romans. Another one of Philo's nephews then became procurator for Judea, another Roman official, in other words, and he was later actually prefect of Egypt. So again, all of these guys are high officials and quite wealthy. Philo himself was elected to lead the Jewish delegation to Emperor Caligula and make a presentation right in front of the emperor in the year 38. Caligula is not the number one emperor that you want to make a delegation in front of, however. Fortunately, it went okay we'll see. We'll show you what Josephus has to say. So Josephus, who is a first century Hellenized Jewish historian who writes in Greek very important histories that are more or less almost all the context we know, or literary context we know, of Jewish life in the first century of the Common Era. He has a section here on Philo's embassy because it's important enough to make it into the history. And so he says, there was now a tumult, this is Josephus, arisen out of Alexandria between the Jewish inhabitants and the Greeks. So there's a big riot that takes place between the Greeks and the Jews. There's also obviously Egyptians, so there's multiple different peoples in this cosmopolitan city. And 3 ambassadors were chosen out of each party that were at variance, who came to Gaius, as he says, which is to say what we call Caligula. Gaius Julius, whatever Caligula's full name is. Anyway, Caesar. Now, one of these ambassadors from the people of Alexandria was Appian, so that's the Greek leader of the Greek party, who uttered many blasphemies against the Jews, and among other things he said he charged them with neglecting the honors that belonged to Caesar, for that all who were subject to the Roman Empire built altars and temples to Gaius, building a temple to the genius of the emperor Caligula, and in other regards universally received him as they received the gods. These Jews alone thought it a dishonorable thing for them to erect statues in honor of him, as well as to swear by his name. So this is, something that actually is correct, right? Which is to say, Jews are and have always been iconoclastic, and so they don't believe in making statues, especially of images, and especially of making statues of images involving divinities and prayers. And also of, for example, what the Romans required is essentially when, say, like the Americans do with the Pledge Allegiance to the flag, and you say kind of that pledge. In this case, the Romans had the same thing. You have a little tiny altar or setup, a little statue to Caligula, the genius of Caligula. You more or less pick up a little censer that is burning a little bit of incense, and you do that, and maybe say a little prayer in honor of the genius of the emperor, and that means that you're loyal and essentially a citizen of the empire. Obviously, that's blasphemy as far as Jews are concerned, and so in fact, in general, the Jews would get had an exemption, because their religion was believed and understood in Rome to be so very ancient that, and also peculiar and quirky, and the Romans didn't really care. Anyway, so that you could get away with not doing that. But when you get a crazy emperor, like Caligula, then he sort of gets upset about it at a certain point. He starts to think, now why do those guys, not do this for me, this kind of thing. And so anyway, so this is one of those times. So many of these severe things were said by Appian, by which he hoped to provoke Gaius, to provoke Caligula to anger against the Jews, as he was likely to be. But Philo, the principal of the Jewish embassage, a man eminent on all accounts, brother to Alexander the Alabarch, who we've talked about, and not one unskillful in philosophy, as Josephus here notes, was ready to betake himself to make his defense against these accusations. But Gaius prohibited him and bid him be gone. He was also in such a rage that it openly appeared that he was about to do to them some very great mischief. That's a nice way to put it, I guess. I think it would have been quite a horrible mischief, probably. So Philo, being thus affronted, went out and said to those Jews who were about him that they should be of good courage, since Gaius's words indeed showed anger at them, but in reality he had already set God against himself. And so Josephus, knowing the rest of the story, has essentially known that since Caligula is about to die himself, be killed himself, that he didn't actually get to do all of the kind of anti-Jewish things that he wanted to do, like set his image up. He wanted to set his own statue up in the temple in Jerusalem, and that would have caused a whole Jewish revolt and all the other things that he wanted to do. Anyway, he died before that happened. Okay, so that essentially is Philo making it into the one history book we really have about Jews in the first century of the Common Era, or the one historical author. Philo, then, of Alexandria, unlike his brother Alexander, whom Josephus, when he talks about him, says does not follow Jewish traditions, Philo was an adherent of diaspora Second Temple Judaism, so he is an adherent to law and his observance of it, how he understands it. However, he's also trained in Greek philosophy, and his writings attempt to interpret the Septuagint, so the Greek Hebrew scriptures. He doesn't really read them probably much in Hebrew. He might know some Hebrew, but despite his Renaissance cloak, he was actually pretty focused on Greek. And he's been called, by his biographers and people like that, the apex of Jewish Hellenistic syncretism, which is to say, the bringing together of these two different worldviews and thought systems as they're occurring in a cosmopolitan place like Alexandria. Yeah.
You kind of wonder if his first name, because his philosophy means love of knowledge, and his first name is philo, philosophy, whether his first name means knowledge.
Yeah, it means love, right? But
Sophia is love.
Sophia is knowledge. Sophia is wisdom, and so Sophia is wisdom, and Philo is love of. Philosophers, and so he has a name that even is talking about, which is Greek, which is again showing the situation that occurs. This is also a problem, when we read all these books of the histories of the Maccabees. So these, when you're a leader of a Hellenistic kingdom, whether you're Jewish or not, a lot of times there's a lot of pressure to take a Greek name and to essentially live like Greek Hellenistic kings are doing. And when you're a leader of a religious community and a diaspora community in cosmopolitan Alexandria, you are very impressed by all of this philosophical thought that has revolutionized the entire world. And in a lot of cases, then the names, like his brother's named Alexander, which is obviously a Greek name, or Macedonian name, I guess. And same thing, Philo then is from the Greek. So, as we have, like I say, a bunch of works that have come down to us, it's pretty amazing how much has been preserved. He essentially has written commentaries, especially on the Pentateuch or the Torah, the 5 books of the law. And these, though, are very allegorical interpretations of Scripture in which Philo sees Moses, who he sees as the author of these books, as a real precursor of Greek philosophers. And so in some ways he's like Thales or the other 7 sages in Greece, except for now he's also showing that more or less Moses and the other Hebrew prophets also had more or less these same kind of philosophical concepts that have now come down to us. He also has philosophical essays that essentially combine Moses, which is to say the Torah, the Pentateuch, and Plato's dialogues, with ethics then also drawing upon, and explicitly he's talking about Plato and Aristotle, and he'll talk about the Stoics. So essentially drawing from these other contemporary schools of philosophy. And then 3, he writes pro-Jewish apologetic and historical works, like the kind of text that he was going to give to Caligula if Caligula hadn't decided to do some kind of mischief, probably a lot worse. So, okay, we want to look especially on the allegorical. We'll look a little bit on the theology and philosophy, but I also want to look on the allegorical interpretation of Scripture. In his first treatise on allegorical interpretation, Philo quotes Genesis 2:1. On the 6th day, God finished his work that he had made, and he asserts, it would be a sign of great simplicity to think that the world was created in 6 days, or indeed at all in time. So you can see right here he's launching away from, when you could make a very literal interpretation of time and think that the world was created in just 6 days. He's saying that would be great. You'd be a simple person to think that. Because, he says, all time is only the space of days and nights, and these things, the motion of the sun, as the sun passes over the earth and under the earth, and does not necessarily make, but the sun is a portion of heaven, so that one must confess that time is a thing posterior to the world. So in other words, you have to have created the cosmos or the universe first as far as he's concerned, because in order for the time to actually be going, the cosmos has to be in motion. So therefore, what Philo is arguing here is that there couldn't have been a certain number of days before the universe is created, because there is no time before the universe is created. Therefore, it would be correct to say that the world was not created in time, but the time had its existence in consequence of the world, or the cosmos here. For it is the motion of the heaven that has displayed the nature of time. So anyway, it's this is not alien to, we've done before our whole lectures, for example, on Ptolemaic or Aristotelian cosmology. And so this is not alien to that. It isn't something you necessarily would immediately derive from reading Genesis. So, yes, can we get a microphone to Robert?
So Einstein did a clarification of space and time. Have you factored that into this equation or not?
Well, Philo didn't, because he wasn't aware of that. And so I know that a lot of times people would like to, kind of put these up against what we know presently and all this kind of thing. I'm going to try to pull back from not doing that and instead try to understand it in the context that they understood at the time, either by reading the texts on the one hand literally or allegorically in the context of what they otherwise understood from Greek philosophical cosmology. So
the last sentence, for it is the motion of the heaven that is displaying the nature of time, is what Einstein's kind of saying.
Yeah. So yeah, we have to for comments, we have to speak into the microphone so that people can hear us.
Well, I'm trying to speak loudly. I mean, so that last sentence is similar to what Einstein was conceptualizing about time being relative, and coming from the nature of gravity and the creation of the cosmos. It's relative. It has a.
It's not. I wouldn't necessarily say it's relative in this sense, because the idea of it is, what he's saying is that the creation occurs before time exists, and now that time is here, it's existing, and it's going in a perfect cosmic order, as opposed to relative depending on the momentum that anybody has. So anyway, I want to take Einstein out of this and just go back, but I think we can. I mean, often we can read ancient texts, we can read the Bible and decide that we maybe think, oh, well, that really is now being borne out by what we now know in modern science, but in fact you can actually make the arguments almost always both ways. So
if he's taking it based on in part Aristotle's work, Aristotle had a different definition of motion than the term, or the way that we interpret motion is not the same way that Aristotle did. And back a slide when it was talking about a sign of great simplicity is one of the arguments for the simplicity of God, that God can't be made up of too many pieces, because if he was made up of too many pieces, that motion that Aristotle is talking about, that there's a necessary cause or a necessary cause of motion.
Well, so Philo is going to argue that God is simple in that sense, in terms of not being able to be divided into parts. But in this case, he's saying you're an idiot if you believe this. So if you believe that the earth was created in 6 days, you're an idiot. That's what he's saying, you know. So, okay. So he goes on. So we'll try to push it forward here, guys. So he says, when therefore Moses, and so he assumes Moses is the author of the 5 books, the Torah. He says, when Moses says, God completed his works on the 6th day, we must understand that he is speaking not of a number of days, but Moses takes 6 as a perfect number, since it is the first number which is equal in its parts, in the half, in the third, in the 6th part, and since it is produced by the multiplication of 2 unequal factors, 2 and 3, right? And so this is, again, getting into arithmology, this kind of thing that the Pythagoreans, other kinds of Greek philosophers were very interested in. And so essentially we take 6, and so if we take the factors here, 1/6 equals 1, 1/3 equals 2, 1/2 equals 3. If you add those up, 1 2 plus 3 equals 6. And also if you take 2 and 3 times 3 equals 6. So in other words, he's saying this is a really important number as far as this kind of numerology and arithmology.
1 times 3 equals 6.
Oh yeah, 1 times 2 times 3. You're right. You're right. I should say that. 1 times 2 times 3 equals 6. Perfect. So, okay. Philo continues. Not only what it is akin to the motions of organic animals, for an organic body is naturally capable of motion in 6 directions: forwards, backwards, upwards, downwards, and to the left and to the right. You know, just like the queen. She can move in any direction, right? Only 4. She can't go up and down. So only you're right. Not like the queen, but I like the queen. Doing that.
When they play fancy chess in Star Trek,
Oh, that's right.
you can go
She
more,
can go
more
up and
levels,
down on
diagonals.
3D chess in Star Trek. You're right. You're right. Okay, good. Okay. He continues. By the way, this kind of numerology or arithmology goes on and on and on and on and on. So I'm just giving you a taste. And at all events, Moses desires to show that the races of mortal beings and also of all immortal beings exist according to their appropriate numbers, measuring mortal beings, I have said, by the number 6, and the blessed and immortal beings by the number 7. So 7 is going to be this perfect number in a different way that's representing heavenly things, whereas all of the creation that's happening in the 6 days is of the mortal physical things that number 6, right? And so anyway, that's enough of that. He goes on and on with that kind of stuff. So in this course of this, so he's talking about the creation here. In the course of reading early Genesis, like many serious readers of the Bible throughout the ages, Philo notes that there are essentially 2 distinct and in some cases contradictory creation stories in Genesis that are one right after the other. So the first one is Genesis 1 through Genesis 2:3, and the second one is in Genesis 2:4 through 2:25. And so most modern scholars explain this by the documentary hypothesis as the works of 2 separate authors who scholars call the priestly author and the Yahwist author, so P and J. And so we're going to have a whole lecture on that, so I'm not going to go into details on that, but we're going to have a whole lecture on that in March. And it's very interesting stuff. But essentially, the idea of it is that modern literary criticism doesn't see Moses as the author of any of those 5 books. But not having that explanation, not having literary criticism, not having modern academic history, Philo is viewing these texts as Moses, so he has to understand, well, why does an author give the one and then the other? And so Philo reads these then as a spiritual, physical dualism, like we see in almost all of Greek philosophical thought. Quoting Genesis 2:7, he says, or the Genesis 2:7 in the Septuagint says, "And God created man, taking a lump of clay from the earth, and breathed into his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul." And Philo's interpretation then is the races of men are twofold. One of them is the heavenly man that is created in that first creation story. God made man in his own image, and he is actually male and female created he them. So in other words, it's a spiritual creation as far as Philo is saying. And then this one with the lump of clay with the spirit infused is more of the physical creation. And so now the heavenly man, Philo says, as being born in the image of God, has no participation in any corruptible or earth-like essence, but the earthly man is of loose material. And so as we've done our, if you remember all of our pre-Socratic philosophy, where there is this dichotomy that they're very worried about between things that are perfect and imperishable, so Plato's forms, all of the things that are spirit and therefore eternal and incorruptible, and then all of the things that are physical and that we see erode away and have entropy and all the other kinds of problems are mortal. These are the two different dichotomies, and he's dealing with that for people here as he's seeing it in this interpretation, allegorical interpretation of Scripture. The earthly man is of loose material, which Moses calls a lump of clay, on which account Moses says, not that the heavenly man was made, but that he was fashioned according to the image of God, but the earthly man he calls a thing made and not begotten by the maker, right? So essentially you're having two different qualities that are infused in each kind of person, essentially the spiritual and the physical. Philo thus reads Genesis in light of the Greek mind-body, material, immaterial, perishable, imperishable, unchangeable, changeable dualism that we see so much. The earthly or material human is something that God makes of perishable material. The heavenly or immaterial is formed or begotten in the image of God, which is eternal and imperishable, like Plato's forms. I kind of ad-libbed that without that slide. But anyway, so here I said it again. Okay. So Philo goes on and actually throughout to caution you against literal readings, and he definitely tells people that don't be fooled, don't read this literally. You're going to be taken, get it wrong if you do. So when he's talking about Genesis 2:7 in his commentary, he says, now the expression breathed into that we just barely read is equivalent to inspired or gave life to. Things inanimate. For let us take care that we are never filled with such absurdity as to think that God employs the organs of a mouth or nostrils for the purpose of breathing into anything. For God is not only devoid of any qualities, but he is likewise not the form of a man, and the use of these words shows some more secret mysteries of nature. So in that same way, we're going to get to this idea of not parts, right? So in other words, simplicity and not just... we shouldn't be reading this literally as God walking around in the Garden of Eden, that kind of thing. So concerning Genesis 2:8, Philo then ridicules a literal reading of God planted a paradise in Eden. So he says, let not such impiety. So you're really not even religious properly. You're blasphemous here. If you ever occupy our thoughts as to suppose that God cultivates lands and plants paradises, since if we were to do so, we should presently be raising the question why he does so. For it could not be that he might provide himself with pleasant places of recreation and pastime or with amusement. God doesn't need those kind of things, right? Let not such fabulous nonsense ever enter our minds, for even the whole world would not be a worthy place of habitation for God, since he is a place unto himself, and he himself is full of himself, and he himself is sufficient for himself, filling up and surrounding everything else which is deficient in every respect or deserted or empty, but he himself is surrounded by nothing else, as being himself one and the universe. And so essentially here, what we're having is a very strong ridicule against literal reading, and instead Philo is essentially presenting his own theology, which is very strongly monist. It's different from either Rabbinic Judaism or Christianity or Islam or anything, because in fact it's God in Philo really is part. The universe is also part of God in terms of all, isn't separated out from God. So it's more monist and more than let's say transcendent God that we'll get in Christianity and
Stoic.
Different. Yeah, more like the Stoics.
It's like the old child's way of writing down their address, their street address, and their town and their country, and the earth, the universe, the mind of God.
So there you go. That would be like at the end of the address, or in God's case, his address is 00001. And you can just always go there. Okay, so let's go and get a little bit of the Greek background that is informing these kind of thoughts that Philo's having. So reasoning by analogy, where are we doing these things where we're not doing literal reading? What are we doing instead? So Greek philosophical thought made use of reasoning by analogy. The word analogia means proportionality and could be used mathematically. So when we're doing just very...
Analogia. No, you're right.
Analogia? Yeah.
Analogia.
Sorry, yeah. It could be used mathematically to mean proportion. So when we're doing these kind of things, if we do geometry, if we remember A, is to B, as then C is to what, and so we D, turns out, or whatever it is. So simple analogies as hand is to arm, as foot is to leg. Exactly. So we can all reason by analogy. So there's also more sophisticated analogies in Plato and Aristotle. We've done this before when we did the the allegory of the cave, or when we're doing reading the Republic. And so this is Plato's analogy of the divided line, and it's kind of important to this. You can also see why Philo talks so much about numbers, and this also talks about proportions. So when we draw a line, we divide it into two unequal sections, and it doesn't matter where we did. I just did it lower that way. And then, if we then do by proportion, we make two further cuts so that those cuts are each in the same proportion as the others. So again, this is almost because we're talking about proportion, which also is how you translate, proportio is how you translate analogia into Latin. So proportion. Then what they'll end up noting is, by wonderful magic of geometry, that B and C are equal in length. And that I'm not proving for you mathematically, but it can be done. So anyway, so essentially there is kind of showing already this kind of mathemagic that also, we heard Philo talking about with numbers like 6 and 7 and things like that. So we have this divided line as Plato's way of ordering more or less his whole system. So essentially he takes those two different lines, he's dividing things and his ideas about the universe into sensible objects, things that we can touch and feel and see and hear and all that taste, and then intelligible objects, things that can't be sensed but can only be understood in our minds by understanding them conceptually, intellectually. And so each one of these, as we understand them, we have to understand them in analogies to each other and going upwards. So the lowest category is images, and these are things like shadows. So the shadow that my hand is casting is only, it only has its existence because my hand is casting it. And so the images here in D is the very lowest kind of thing. And it is only then you understand that how less a thing that is to my hand is how much images are to sensible things like my hand that you can, feel if I jab you with it, right? And so in that whole kind of thing, that whole class of things that we can sense, and then from that, then getting across to the next one, we have to understand, analogously. So. In the same way that a shadow is to an actual physical object like a hand, mathematical objects that make up the hand are that much more important and that much more real than the sensible things. And then ultimately, those mathematics are formed by the ultimate images or forms or ideas that are, for Plato, the end-all of everything, right? And so that essentially is, again, reasoning by analogy and proportion, and it actually is the central idea that Plato has, and it uses mathematics and also proportion to even show it. So analogy can be very, very important to ancient Greek thought. We also talked about Plato, in order to get at his form of forms, which is good, the good, or goodness for goodness sake, he uses an analogy of the sun or allegory of the sun in order to understand, again, the physical world. The sun is lighting that and illuminating that the same way. Then the greatest form, the form of forms, the good, is illuminating, in this intelligible realm, everything that makes up the intelligible realm. So, likewise, Aristotle, who, as we know, doesn't agree with Plato on everything, and indeed, their argument has been one of the major bases for all of Western philosophy ever since. At the heart of Aristotle's empiricism and his argument with Plato is the idea that actually all of these physical things that Plato's quite dismissive of, because the real things are really these forms and ideals that he's trying to reason to. Aristotle, by contrast, says you can take all of those things and use them and study them in order to get to something's final cause, which is to say that same ultimate purpose that Plato is talking about. And so that can be deduced from these lower types of causes, something's material cause, and this is, anyway, how Aristotle explains it, which is to say, it should say matter, they're not mater. But anyway, the material cause, what is a thing made of? So the book here is made of paper, right? The formal cause, what is its configuration, right? What is its essence of it? How did it happen? How did we write it? How did we manufacture it? What is its efficient cause? What agent made it? And then finally, what's its purpose? And so, in other words, you can use empiricism, Aristotle thinks, in order to get to what the purpose of everything is. And in order to do that, in order to show that, he uses analogy. So analogy is also very important here for this. So to get to that idea of teleology or end or final cause or purpose, in other words, the final cause, Aristotle says, of an acorn, I missed a slide. Anyway, whatever, is to be an oak tree. In the same way, then, he relies on an analogy of that in the same way that we can't, to assert it, you look at an acorn and you don't necessarily understand that the final purpose of it is to make an oak tree, because it's natural generation and there may well be other explanations. But he does say that in an artistic creation, in something that is built, for example, by humans, like a house, all of the whole process and everything and components that went into building that, you really can't understand what almost all of these things were if you don't understand what the final product or the purpose of the house in that sense was. And so he uses then that analogy from artistry, and we're fairly familiar with that. So that's also been used cosmologically, right, where people will use that in talking about intelligent design. We'll say, like the deist said about the watchmaker God. So essentially, just like God has created when you find a watch, it's very complicated and it's winding and going, you presume that there must have been a maker. And so by analogy, you see this universe that's all going, that you presume somebody wound that up to begin with. So that's an argument that has been made. So that kind of analogy. So finding then final causes in nature and also in what the Greeks had that's kind of equivalent of their scripture, so these original epic poets, Homer and Hesiod. So as early as then, the 6th century BCE, so even before some of these things, a guy named Theognis of Rhegium argued for essentially an allegorical interpretation of Homer. So we shouldn't be reading Homer literally. We shouldn't be reading all of these terrible things that the gods are doing in the same sort of unethical or literal sense, because instead we should understand these as having deeper or more allegorical truths. And so the struggle of the gods in Homer is an analogy, for example, he said, of the opposition between the elements. So as we now have started to understand, or in Greek science, they have air, earth, fire, and water, and they have these different opposition to each other. In that same way, we can be reading about those allegorically in Homer, as opposed to, in the struggle between Hera and whoever's against her. Zeus. Well, Zeus usually, yeah. I'm just saying on the Trojan and on the different side. Anyway, so she's on the Greek side and Aphrodite is on the Trojan side. So Prodicus then of Chaos in the 5th century interprets the gods in Homer as personification of substances. So Demeter, who's the god of grain, represents bread and grain. Dionysus is, the god obviously of wine and frivolity. He represents wine. Poseidon, the god of the sea, represents water. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, represents fire. So essentially, reading all of these or reinterpreting all of these kind of mythological stories allegorically has something that is, well in the Greek tradition by the time you get to Philo. So Philo's allegorical interpretation then of Septuagint is completely in keeping with the way Greeks already are reinterpreting their own mythological texts. And Greek-speaking Jews in the 1st century, For example, so there's other Greeks now. I'm sorry, other Jews who are Greek speaking in the first century, and we'll mention the ones who then did become convinced that Jesus of Nazareth is the Christos or the Messiah. They likewise read the Septuagint, as we mentioned, but they also read it allegorically rather than literally. So they're in the same kind of school as Philo. So beginning with Paul, who's the earliest Christian whose writings are preserved. Paul is he's self-identified as had been a Pharisee, so he's a Greek-speaking Jew from Anatolia. So the diaspora, in other words. So Christians in antiquity and the Middle Ages similarly argue against literal interpretation of Scripture. You may not think that because you maybe know a lot of Christians today who you think maybe are kind of medieval, who are very fundamental or literal in their interpretation, but that's quite a new thing. So Paul, in one of his letters, so 2 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians as Donald Trump calls it, 2 Corinthians 3:6 says, God has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, which is the same word as testament, ministers of a new covenant, New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter, literal, kills, but the Spirit gives life, right? So cautioning here against literal interpretation. New Testament readers also read, the New Testament authors also read the Septuagint typologically, as it's called. So stories in the text are understood, this is again like a Greek thing, to be a type, typos or typon, is which is to say an image or a reflection of the perfect antitype, which we call like archetypes. So if you think of like archetypes, right? But essentially it's a term of antitype, and it's almost the same kind of thing where we have with Plato, where the form is like the person that has the, like a moneyer, you're making a coin, and he's got the actual thing that, like you stamp the stamp, and then it creates the coin. So the coin is simply the image of that, or actually they use it with, the coin's kind of solid, so they usually use this with wax. So essentially the wax and seal. So the wax and seal is simply the image of what the stamp does, right? And so essentially the seal is the type, of the antitype that makes it. And we know archetypes now, right? So thus in that same exact way, the person who's the author of the first epistle of Peter, who's not actually Peter, but anyway, 1 Peter 3:20 and 21 compares the flood story in Genesis to baptism, and he calls then baptism, Christian baptism, the antitype, and therefore the flood is the type or the reflection or image of that eternal perfect truth, right, of the idea of baptism as far as that author is concerned. So that's actually an explicit use of type and antitype, right? Both of these. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, interprets the story of Adam in Genesis explicitly typologically. Again, he calls Adam a type of the one who is to come. So Christ, in this case, is the antitype in this particular interpretation. So the person who's conquering death, the person who brings death upon everybody, according to Paul's theology. Likewise, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives a typological interpretation of the story of Jonah. So he says, quote, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth." So in other words, Jonah and the whale is not to be read literally, but it's meant to be read allegorically, as a type of Christ's resurrection, which is the true archetype or antitype, right? And so this is throughout all of the Christian New Testament. This is how Christians composed the New Testament. This is how they understood their understanding of how the Septuagint relates to the Christian understanding of what's going on in Christian theology. And so it's all read allegorically, typologically, as opposed to literally. So,
can you fix your microphone? Because you put it under your shirt.
well, it doesn't.
Yeah, well, let's put it in the pocket, maybe. The head has to be down.
Okay, is that working?
That's better. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's go back to Philo. So another very interesting thing. So we talked about all this allegory and how this is actually common in Greek-speaking, actually for Greeks for their own mythology, and also for other Greek-speaking Jews for their interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. The Septuagint. Let's go back to another one of Philo's major ideas, and this is his conception of logos. So the heart of a bunch of his ideas, and it's actually all over the place throughout all his texts, Philo derives when he's doing all of his allegorical reading of Scripture is to kind of winnow out and to bring forward and explain his idea of logos, which is this amazingly important Greek word that means everything from word, but not so much just like a individual word, but word itself in a bigger sense, discourse, reason, logic, all kinds of different things logos means. For Philo, he says in different places, logos is the firstborn of God, which is to say the highest intermediate between, highest intermediate being necessary to bridge the enormous gap between the infinite and humans. So inasmuch as Philo, as we were just saying when I explained, we kind of did that whole God is all of this stuff, right? And Philo went on and on and on in that address of oneness, this way too much that God actually represents. To get between God then and then individual guys like Philo and me, there needs to be then some kind of intermediary so that we can kind of, even understand, have some kind of connection. And the most important intermediating bridge between God and individuals is the logos, which Philo then calls here the firstborn of God.
Is that
So,
the form?
is what?
He would equate the logos to the form?
Yes.
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, does Philo call the logos a form, or the form, and he does at some point or other equate it with the form of forms. So for him, it's not the ultimate. The ultimate is essentially God, and then this is the next one. So it's like, so Aristotle has like a demiurge, so there's like the different kinds of levels, essentially the very first one after God, so form after God. So Philo writes, for the Father of the universe has caused him, the Logos, to spring up as the eldest son, whom in another passage, Moses, so again he's quoting Moses, or he's deriving this from Moses, or his allegorical interpretation of Moses, Moses calls the firstborn, and he, who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father, has formed such and such species, looking to his archetypal patterns. So essentially all of creation is happening through this form of the Logos, God's Logos. So in different texts, we can't go into it as a really long, complicated, different way, and it's actually somewhat contradictory sometimes, all the different things. Philo's also a mystic, and so he has different ways that he thinks about the Logos, but he calls the Logos as things such as the form of forms, so that's almost like what Plato's good is. The firstborn of God, who is then unbegotten also. Divine wisdom, the daughter of God. He goes through a whole long way in which the form of God is, or the Logos is neither male or female, or is actually both, and so therefore can be, even though wisdom in both Hebrew and Greek is a female word, and so therefore the female divine, we shouldn't get all hung up about that, he says. So essentially it's both the Son of God and the daughter wisdom. And a second hypostasization of God. And so if you might be aware of this word hypostasis, but only if you're a Christian theologian. so we'll get to or maybe if you're Valerie.
Sorry, I'm reminded that, and this is in view of the idea that God speaks the universe into being. God
Yes.
said, "Let there be light," and there was light, etc.
Right.
And apparently in various cultures in times gone by, there was word magic. Where the
Yes.
enunciation, the pronouncement of words
Yes.
carried a magical whammy, and some
Oh, yeah.
words were very sacred, and some were so sacred you weren't supposed to speak them, like the name of God. And so I'm wondering, how much this is rooted in this very ancient belief, possibly.
Oh, I think it's very rooted in this. So he's deriving this from this same story, so we've already read like some of this. So the creation story where God says, let there be light, and there was light. So the word is right there, and in terms of that's the word, right? And so then, and that word is creation, and so all things are created through this logos. But there has been, like all the way back, even before it being magic, in a lot of things, we have like in the Ten Commandments, they say, so let it be written, so let it be done, right? It's one of their little phrases, but essentially, if you say it, it is real. And we've come back to that with postmodernism, right? But this actually was the way. So saying the thing, and this is true, for example, in all of, let's say, Egyptian spells and everything like that, you speak all of these words, and that's what allows the souls of the dead to make it through all of the different things in the Book of the Dead, the Book of Breathings and things. So the spoken word has those kind of powers, and just even saying things makes it so. And also, this is why up until very, very recently, when the culture was, oral, giving an oath is really huge. And if you swear some kind of oath and you say, oh, I'm going to do this thing, a rash oath, I mean, people who make rash oaths like that in the Hebrew Bible, I swear, if God gives me this victory, I'll sacrifice whatever I see when I come home to my, when I, come home, and the first thing he sees is his daughter, so he has to commit, human sacrifice, right? And so this, so this is those kind of power that those kind of oaths have. When you get to the Middle Ages, when the kings are oath, so like when we do with Becket, Henry, who has Becket killed, maybe, or anyway, whose knights kill Becket, is an oath breaker, and he's a great king, but he's not trustworthy, And so anyway, that's a big problem for everybody. So oaths are huge, and that is a big thing. So word, so it's all in there, yeah. And so anyway, a second hypostazation of God in the form of God's creative power. So in other words, the Logos in some senses essentially is God, but different from the Creator. The hypostazation of God's power, so essentially a second person of God, and the mediator then between the Creator and the created universe, and the thing that's filling the universe, and mediating between the two different portions of God, the justice and the mercy. So there's all kinds of different things in this conception of Logos. But what's especially interesting, because otherwise Philo would it'd be his own speculation, and he doesn't have any descendants in this, but how much the Logos then makes it into Christianity's own peculiar theology. And so in the retelling of this same Genesis story that we've been reading Philo's commentary on from the fourth gospel, as we say, that's attributed to John, in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. I mean, it's usually, we say word, we aren't using that Greek, but the Greek here is the Logos. He was in the beginning with God, all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being, right? And so it's almost the same, in that portion of it, the same idea of the Logos, and in this case, this hypostasis of God, who is God, right, is with God and is God, then is understood the second person of the Trinity to be Christ in Christianity, right? So it's possible but uncertain whether Philo was read by the author of John, and also the letters. There's a bunch of different stuff in it that kind of indicate they're kind of akin to some of Philo's stuff. The letter to Hebrew and/or Paul, even we've seen have some things. There's nothing though that shows literary dependence, so they're not quoting him or anything. However, Philo's work does influence very important schools of early Christian thinkers, including Clement of Alexandria and his very brilliant student Origen of Alexandria, who's really the first super great Christian theologian and also amazingly prolific and influential. So especially influential in just more or less securing for antiquity and the Middle Ages for Christians allegorical interpretation of Scripture. So I'm just going to say then, when we're going back to this in terms of this overall influence, it's not the same hypostatic union. So this monism that we've talked about that's a little closer to the Stoics and that kind of thing that Philo has created is different from what the Christians ultimately come up with theology. But I'm going to suggest here it's like the same kind of philosophical ballpark. So Philo, is envisioning then a hypostasis between the Creator and his unbegotten first Son, the Logos, and that's not the same necessarily as it's not the same actually, as the three co-eternal, consubstantial persons, with that word person here, hypostasis of the Trinity, Creator, Son, and Spirit, but we are really kind of in that same Hellenistic Alexandrian theological ballpark. So, in that sense, I mean, whereas it may not indirectly and also somewhat directly, Christianity, Philo is arguably sort of massively influential over especially then interpretation of Scripture, but also gave a lot of tools to later Christian theologians in developing doctrines like the Trinity. What kind of influence did Philo have on Judaism? Not much. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking that this surely influenced the Neoplatonists. Surely it did, because they were like, what, second, third century, and through Neoplatonism, possibly.
Got back to Judaism.
Yeah.
Yeah, so indirect. So that's true. So in as much as Philo influenced Christians who influenced Neoplatonists who reinterpret and also influenced Christians, or in as much as then Christians also influenced Jews, it would be indirectly that way. But in terms of a direct influence, though, rabbis, for example, did not preserve Philo's texts, and they're therefore only known. We have these because of Christian monks who are preserving them, right? So this is not stuff that made it into the Talmud, even though he's obviously a very important first century Jewish thinker. From the standpoint, obviously, of Jews who saw no compelling reason to view Jesus as the Messiah, the experiment with Hellenism led to the disaster of Christianity, which is to say a Greek-speaking community who used Philo's ideas to allegorize away that idea that you even have to obey law anymore. So Christians, in fact, didn't, in like one generation, actually argued quite strongly that if you obey Torah, if you obey the Hebrew commandments in the Hebrew Bible, that means you're rejecting Christ. So Paul quite strongly, at a certain point when he's really arguing strongly, if you get circumcised, that means Christ might as well died for nothing. You're getting nothing out of it. So he was quite strongly against Christians going ahead and doing that. And in fact, even though Christians today often read like Leviticus and they think that somehow applies to them because they don't really know anything any better. In fact, actually, even things like the Ten Commandments, Augustine, who again was our major thinkers, who's influenced by people like Origen and going back to Clement and Philo, Augustine says Christians absolutely should not follow the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, specifically keep the Sabbath day holy. Christians should not be keeping the Sabbath day holy because the celebration of Christianity is on the Lord's Day, which is Sunday. And so it's a thing that got lost in English, and so people, became Seventh-day Sabbatarians and all this kind of a thing. But anyway, it's a long, confusing history that Christianity has. But anyway, going all the way back to this, this was obviously inimical to what the rabbis' interpretation of, and how they then, in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple, and also creating then a new diaspora Judaism, what they wanted to adhere to. So in these circumstances, I think it's really not surprising that the rabbis decided to consign Philo's text, to the scrap heap. So anyway, goodbye. So Judaism is Greek philosophy.
I read somewhere sometime that.
Is the mic on?
Oh, yeah. I read somewhere sometime that at some point, and you probably know about this, the ancient Jews weren't sure whether they should carry on, whether Hebrew or Greek should be the language of religion. And I guess this was, I don't know. What do you know about it?
Well, so definitely at Philo's time, it doesn't seem like there is that much. So Hebrew isn't necessarily being used, especially through the whole Western diaspora. And I would say that it may well be that through the East, certainly the common tongue is Aramaic. But because they're close enough, I think that the people who are the Aramaic speakers didn't feel the need to translate the Hebrew. But when you're dealing with this kind of time period where the population, the Jewish population of Alexandria, if it's maybe possibly as much as a third of the city, if you could imagine, that's so many more people, largest urban population of Jews. So those guys, many of whom then, did all of their scripture reading in Greek, They may well have been. Philo, it's not clear how much Hebrew, how good he was at Hebrew. And so it may well be, you know, I mean, Augustine was no good at Greek, you know, so anyway, it may well be that, that they were already doing that. But then I'm not as familiar, we'd have to do a bunch of study on how exactly the rabbis went about it, but they definitely, in the next centuries, as the rabbis are putting together Talmud and everything, they privileged the Babylonian Talmud over the Western one, the one that's from, you know, Judea, because of, again, maybe because of this contamination, you know, that's happening because the Christians, you know, have run away, you know, hijacked their religion and done all these crazy things with it.
The synagogue is a Greek word.
Yeah, synagogue is a Greek word. So you turned off the microphone again. Sorry. Okay.
I
Yes,
get
that's right.
distracted with the conversation.
Yeah.
At one point, I kind of looked and I could see where Darwin had climbed in and figured out a species from that. I forgot what frame it was where he suddenly came to my mind.
Yeah. So I mean, so Darwin is, you know, is how we're like one of the final steps of getting past like Aristotle's ideas of categories and everything like that. And so instead of having like ancient thinkers, you know, kind of understood often animals as all become as being essentially part of one species that has always been that way and always would be that way as far as they were concerned. But it's again, in the 19th century, people like Darwin understood the actual mechanism, you know, which is to say that there's evolution. Wouldn't have been privy to that. So. All right. Well, I've run out the clock. So thank you.
there goes my left channel again, or my right channel. Now it's back. Now, yeah, let's see here. It says my stream status is excellent, but then it gives me a message. What time is it now? 4:45, yeah. 5 minutes ago, it gave me a message saying, audio stream's current bitrate is 0, lower than the recommended bitrate. I guess that's just because it went silent, I don't know. It says the stream health is excellent, so I don't know. It's just a weird message. Way to go, stream health. Current bitrate is 0. How could it be 0 if you can hear me and I was just broadcasting my YouTube? I don't know what they're talking about. Maybe it just dropped out or something. Anyway, where am I here? You know, this thing is going to be done before the night is over, I think, and that's wonderful because I need to get to the next one, to the next drawing. I just got to make a environment for these guys, finish this guy's face. Yeah, you can hear me great. So that guy didn't really go in too deep about, I mean, he just kind of did a sort of an overview of who he was in relation to the Christian orthodoxy, I guess. I don't really, I mean, obviously he didn't go into any of his writings and stuff, but he did mention some things about saying, basically, he's just basically saying, I understand. Seems like he's saying, oh no, everybody else has got it wrong. I understand the ununderstandable about God, and they think they understand God, and I understand that it's more it's like he said, God couldn't have created the world in 6 days because the world didn't exist until, like, 6 days doesn't exist until the world is created. And so this is like one of these fundamental conundrums of existence. Like, how can you have anything if you have nothing? And how can you have nothing if you don't have anything? And this is what philosophy is always, you know, relativity and this kind of thing. And I was talking to, I met a guy the other day who, you know, his whole thing, he was a devout Christian and really gung-ho. And his whole attitude was, oh, I understand things about, you know, I understand better than most Christians what's going on. And this is why I can't, you know, this is why, I mean, this kind of attitude, I just can't take it. I mean, I think I know everything, but I try to keep that attitude to myself, because believe me, I think I know, well, because 80% of the time I'm saying, well, nobody knows and I don't know, so that's why I'm right. I don't know. Chicken or the egg, yeah. Let's see, where am I here? Oh yeah, I got my... Yeah, I don't, well, anyway, I don't know. I don't mean to try and sound like I'm defending or anything, but I don't listen to Alan Watts to learn anything. I listen to Alan Watts because he makes me laugh, and I just so happens I agree with his take on most things. I mean, he has one talk where he clearly indicates that he believes that the earth is round, and many of his talks clearly indicate that he believes that we live on a spinning ball in the middle of a universe, and that we understand everything about the universe, and that, you know, stars are planets and all this stuff. And of course, just because my opinion is that he shouldn't presume to know these truths just because he was told. You know, it's funny, but that doesn't mean that, you know, we can't all get along, right? Anyway, I don't know. He said that there's a Zen, like, he delivered it a lot better than I can, but he said there's a Zen idea that, you know, you address giant questions with answers from the practical side of life, and you address practical questions from the existential side of things. And so he said that, you know, if you ask, you know, what's the meaning of life? Oh, I had an egg for breakfast. And if you say, oh, what's for dinner? Who are you? Who's asking this question? Who are you really? And to me, I think that would be funny, to actually go about daily life, actually addressing people that way or interacting with people that way. That's hilarious. Oh, that's obvious, Skull. You're a very friendly, open-minded person, and pretty much seem to be the kind of person who doesn't judge people or expect anything from people. And it's no coincidence that you cultivate a sort of a community Let's see. I don't really want that to look like that. Maybe I want it to be like this. I really don't know what I want this guy to look like. I mean, I want him to look just like the other guy, but I don't know if that's the best idea. I think he looks better without this. Even though the other guy has that. Maybe if I just make it smaller. It's crazy how many different countries and perspectives come around my tiny channel. Yeah, that's cool. Whoa. Another thing about Zen and Buddhism and stuff, that all works if you're in a nice, comfortable house with small problems. I don't know how Buddhism helps you if you're in a dungeon being tortured by your enemies. I guess it's not supposed to, you know, and that would be the point. So that gets me about that kind of stuff. But so far as I know, I mean, so far in my lifetime, that has been not, those aren't my experiences. My experiences are from the point of view of comfort, relative comfort, and what's another word for comfort? You know, whatever, right? Very lucky person I am. All right, let's just give this guy. Two pointy. Okay. Let's try this. I think that is what we've done. Oh. The fact you realize the comfort says a lot. Many don't realize or appreciate our situation. Absolutely. Absolutely, and we're in a really good place. I mean, you know, it's tricky because it's easy. I mean, that's the problem. That's what everybody's upset about. Everything isn't right. Everything's going wrong. Everything's upside down. The wrong people are in charge of our media. All this stuff. There's all these things to complain about. And so, just being grateful is like the problem with Buddhism and Zen and stuff like that. Grateful for what? Grateful for these gas prices. Grateful for the fact that I can't find a decent job and and have a pleasant day. I have to put up with all this nonsense and on 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 and on. All this stuff, you know, just the way society is and the way all this stuff. I mean, it's this, you know, on the one hand, we're supposed to stand up for our human rights and all this stuff, and on the other hand, we're supposed to be grateful for all that for not, you know, being in a worse situation than we are. It's like, you know, oh, you're just a pacifist weakling for being, you know, don't be grateful. And there is something to that. One shouldn't be a jellyfish, but one shouldn't propose that they should be the great white of the sea, Or should they? I don't know, because somebody is. I mean, there's always a great white around the corner. Just lucky he doesn't eat jellyfish. Anyway, that's just too much rambling. Too much. It just never ends. Let's see. I wonder if I should do this. No. Oh, maybe that. Okay, first of all, drop all of this onto that layer. Then we can do this. I know one thing about you. How old are your kids? Nope, don't like that. Yeah, this is better. He looks better without any indication there. And 7 and 10, wow, 10. That's getting up there, baby. It's gonna be, you're gonna turn around and they're not gonna be kids anymore. 10 is that sweet spot. The changes are gonna start happening fast and furious. Well, of course, the whole thing is a changing. You know, one minute they can't walk, the next minute they're telling you what they want to watch on TV. Wow. I'm gonna call these guys done, and I gotta put an environment. Notice I don't use the term background. That is a bad, naughty word for artists to use. Okay, so I can't, you know, it's so funny. This simple style of mine, it's not something that comes naturally. I have to really work to get it out because I don't have the, what's the word? I don't have the, I don't draw often enough to have a visual library. But if I try to draw these guys again, they'll come out pretty close because now I do have a visual library. Let's see, where's the sketch of these guys? They're getting big. Yahoo! Anyway, my only point was, long story short, I happen to understand, now that they're getting a little older, it changes a little bit, but I know that feeling where nothing matters except the fact that they feel jolly, comfortable, you know, happy, satisfied, whatnot, you know. When you got little kids like that, I know that that's all that matters, is their comfort and their happiness is just about all that matters. Unless you're an asshole and you don't like your kids. What am I looking for here? This. So this was the sketch. Do I have the mannequins? Yeah, these were based on some mannequins. These mannequins look, of course, a lot more like the guys in the movie for obvious reasons. The guys in the movies were just big guys in these furry costumes. But I wanted to stylize them and make them my own. The kid almost looks like he's from a different thing. He's way more detailed. But that's because I don't have any shorthand for drawing little kids or people, period. Boy. But I like this. I like the way it came out. I just don't. The only thing I don't like is how he's got. Well, he's got all this. You know, he's wearing what he's wearing, and these guys are basically naked, and I would have to put a lot more wrinkles and stuff on them to indicate their weird furry suits that they were wearing. If it was going to be realistic, I'd have to, oh, that's right, I did do this. Got this, I gotta put this line here. Don't mind me, I'm just rambling. What's this? Being single, Dad, will turn you into an asshole, trust me. I see. In doing research for this book, this movie came out in 1953, which is really weird because there weren't a lot of movies. This movie is not a copy of other movies. Other movies are copies of this movie. If anything, literally, I mean, aside from anyway, yeah, it's real. I love, if there's one thing I like, it's discovering, what's the word, chronology. So another example is this movie here, The Thing from Another World. This movie is really not very good, in my opinion. But it is the first movie of its kind. It is the first mainstream movie, like, you know, not a Buck Rogers serial or something like that. This was the first movie that slyly created like a Frankenstein type monster, except it's from outer space, and it's, you know, not a human being or an animal like we understand it. So all of this weird sci-fi stuff was brand new to audiences, and that's why the movie doesn't seem like much, because it didn't have to be. It just needed to be a freaky Frankenstein-like monster, but with a backstory that was unlike anything audiences had seen before. And so I just find that all very interesting. Anyway, I guess I gotta take another break on these guys, on this live stream. Do not save the movie. Let's see. All right, I'm gonna take another break. I don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do, if I'll be back or whatever. Oh, hey, Skull, if you're there, I need to ask you a question. So I'm thinking about joining in on the movie party tonight that Smurfer girl plans on having, but I don't know if she is going to stream that movie from her Smurfer girl channel, or does she stream it from somewhere else? a different channel. So, if you could enlighten me, if you know what her story is, and if not, then whatever. There's always another movie streaming channel on Saturday nights. Yeah, I know, I should do my own. Okay, thank you. What the hell time is it, 5:30? 5:10, all right. Yeah, okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by again. Thanks for hanging out. I appreciate the attention. I appreciate the attention to detail. Used to do movie night a lot, but lately not as much. What, her or you? Yeah, and you know, I don't know if you care, but you know, that movie last night, I kind of enjoyed it, really. And also, like, that's what I mean. Like, I like a crappy movie like that. And I'll tell you something. Mysteries just experienced exactly what I was taught, because he feels basically the same way about it as me, although I feel about it much more strongly and blah, 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 blah. He tried to watch Napoleon Dynamite the other night, and he couldn't get through it. Now, there's a difference, and the thing is, it's different. It's not the same thing. Like an old, if he or I, well, I'll speak for me, but he's the same way. You know, if I try to watch like an old '50s movie that kind of stinks, I'll be like disappointed because this movie's boring. I don't really like it. I don't need to see what happens at the end. But contemporary films, it's not, oh, I'm bored, I don't like this movie. It's, I can't fucking watch this shit. It's like, turn it off. Make it stop. And I know that's what he experienced. I saw him watching it, and I'm like, he ain't gonna watch that movie. And he told me he couldn't watch it. Not because he was bored, not because he didn't think it was good. He could not stand it. It was stinky. Anyway, that's how I feel about these new movies, man. That's how I feel about cinema. But yeah, that's why I'm saying it's odd that silly, stupid piece of junk movie.
Yeah, and
like I find it watchable.
Too.
Yeah.
That stupid, goofy movie. I don't watch.
It's not even a good movie. I mean, I'm not gonna say it's good, but I like it. All right. Anyway.
It was sensational.
Yeah. Okay, so I just thought I'd throw that out there because I'm the only thing. Yeah, I'm just fascinated with my own inability. Like I said, that guy, the young kid, told me I can't watch black and white movies, and I just thought that's the most ridiculous thing. But that's literally how I feel. I can't watch a movie produced after 1985 because it's done all wrong. Like it's everything about it is wrong. Can't even. I could explain it, but I'm not going to. I'm going to sign off and go have something to eat, and we'll be around. I like Jared Hess. I like Jared Hess. I don't know who Jared Hess is. I gotta look him up. Jared Hess. Okay. Okay. So you like the guy? Well, like I said, I related Zeb's experience, and I know mine would be the same. I would be like, I can't watch this. It's not. I'm not entertained. I'm the opposite of entertained. And that movie is old. That's what I mean. I'm talking about if it was produced after 1985, And if it was produced in 1983, it's got a low chance. It's just that it has a sneaking, there might be some wiggle room there. Right, 85, 86. And there are reasons, and I know I could explain these reasons, and I'm not going to because this is not what you signed up for. So, hey, I'm really signing off this time. Have a good night. Maybe I'll catch you at, on the interwebs later on tonight. See you later.